So thank you so much for being here. And for those of you who had to brave Storm Dara, well done for making it through. I arrived on a very bumpy aeroplane back into the UK last night, and I can tell you I felt the full force of the wind. So my name's Claire Shine. I have the honour to be one of the Crown Estate Commissioners, and for over 30 years I've been a champion to see nature going up the policy agenda, so I'm particularly happy to be joining you today. Thank you to all of you, to our speakers, and of course to the Wildlife Trust for partnering with us on this important event. So tonight, as you're going to hear, is really about action, about gearing up for transformation, about changing the lens on how we understand both climate and nature to be at the bedrock of healthy and sustainable economies as well as societies. And climate, we're used to talking climate. We're used to thinking about carbon, even if we are woefully slow, given the scale of the crisis. But for a very long time, nature has been the poor relation in this conversation. It's been outside the market, and it's hard, as we all know, to value in financial terms. And that's reflected in the way that the policy processes have also gone. And we now know that healthy ecosystems are critical to underpin lives and life chances into the future. The whole life support systems on which the industries and economies of the future depend are ours to support and to help with the recovery. The change is beginning to happen globally, as we're going to hear, and nationally in policy and business terms. But it was only in 2016 at the Conference of the Parties for the Biodiversity Convention in Montreal that in 2022, that we started to see business beginning to show up in numbers at that conference. The last time I shared a panel with Craig was in Montreal, and we really had the sense that new faces, new people, new business stakeholders were beginning to see their role as leaders in this space. And I have a particularly grotty phrase. I channel my inner Gwyneth Paltrow, and who talked famously when she divorced about a conscious decoupling from whatever her former husband was called. And I rashly spoke to the head of the OECD that we needed a conscious recoupling of nature and climate. Well, be careful what you wish for. A month later, I got an invitation to go and address the policy chiefs of the OECD on conscious recoupling. And, and I've always felt I live in a dodgy space ever since that day. So today we'll give you the opportunity with our agenda to hear some reflections on both the biodiversity COP in Cali and the climate COP in Baku. And Craig is going to lead a panel debate followed by a discussion with Toby Perkins, the MP, so that you get the chance to hear from a real range of voices and always to be very candid, to be honest, to be thinking about what can and must be done. So in finishing, I'd like to put the emphasis on the word collaboration. We are looking at the Crown Estate in the world at large, at how we need to transform systems in ways that will work for people, for nature, and for climate. And no stakeholder can do it alone. You all know it is lonely to be a leader in politics, in business, in any walk of life. And so for the Crown Estate, it's particularly important for us to be thinking about how we partner, with whom we partner, at all levels and across all sectors, where that can help us to advance our public interest mission for the nation. Climate and biodiversity together are now integral to the way in which the Crown Estate sees that mission to create lasting and shared prosperity for the nation. And I'm very excited not only that you're here tonight, but also that in January we will be publishing our new nature recovery ambitions with a special event in Parliament to help in that process of awareness raising and meaningful collaboration into the long term. So with that, I want to thank you all again for being here. You'll be able to have the chance over drinks to talk to many of the wonderful colleagues in the Crown Estate with questions, ideas and provocations. But for now, I'll pass back to Craig.
Well, Claire, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. I'm Craig Bennett. I'm Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trusts, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to this joint event with the Wildlife Trusts and the Crown Estate. Crown Estate and the Wildlife Trusts have worked together on a number of issues over many, many years. So it's really great to be able to partner up tonight for this really important event, and of course, to use these wonderful offices in the central London. So thank you very much, Claire, and all your colleagues. I'll say a couple of things at the start just about the Wildlife Trust. Hopefully you'll be very well known to us, but people are always sometimes a bit surprised when you hear about the full story of the Wildlife Trust. So we are a federation of locally run wildlife trusts. Of course, you have here in London, you have the London Wildlife Trust, or near here you have Surrey Wildlife Trust or Essex Wildlife Trust or others. Scottish Wildlife Trust, 5 wildlife trusts in Wales, and so on. We have 46 trusts in total, and many people will know their individual local trusts, but actually when you add it up, the scale we have is extraordinary. So if I tell you that we have more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK, in fact 1,000 more, or if you prefer it, we've even got more nature reserves than there are train stations in the UK, 53 more, if you prefer that comparison. We've actually just passed over the last year a collective income of £250 million a year. We have 944,000 members collectively, and we're actually the 7th largest landholder in the UK as well. So sometimes that's kind of hidden behind the stories of individual trusts, but actually the scale we have is extraordinary, and I think that means that we're in a really good place to deliver on the ground, as is often known by the wildlife trusts. We're obviously well known for the work we do in the UK, but over the last couple of years we've been really wanting to kind of look about how we can build the better connections between local to global, and actually the other way around, global to local. And my own frustration in my career is very often when NGOs and commentators talk about nature or climate debate, they do so in either domestic context or an international context. And of course, really what matters is the linkages between the two. So one of the things we've been trying to do at the Wildlife Trust is, if you like, look at what's happening in the international arena around nature and climate and really bring it back very carefully to the very, very local level, which you'll see in the reports on your chairs and so on. We think what matters with these big climate COPs, big nature COPs, is ultimately how they can be delivered at a local level, because that's how they really get delivered, and there's not enough connection and narrative thinking about how we link the two. So that's really the focus tonight, and particularly, of course, as a event that we entitled "How Can UK Business Lead in Delivering on the Global Biodiversity Framework?" One of the things we want to do throughout this evening is think about how we can bring it home. Think about what is happening in the nature COPs, what is happening in the climate COPs, how can we bring it back to the UK, and ultimately right down to the local level for delivery as well, with business, government, and the third sector charities all working together to make that happen. So that's what tonight is all about. We do have some great panels to discuss that, and delighted that Toby Perkins, the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, is joining us as well in a little while. So with that, let's get into it. I'm delighted I think my colleague Kathryn is going to take Claire's pace up here. Kathryn Brown, Dr. Kathryn Brown is Director of Climate and Evidence at the Wildlife Trusts, previously at the Committee on Climate Change, and actually even before that, it was in DEFRA as one of the climate negotiators. So Kathryn is very well placed to tell us what's been happening at these COPs from the kind of, particularly the negotiating side of things, whereas I'm much kind of more big narrative and big picture and looking at it from a more campaign point of view. So Kathryn, you followed very carefully what was happening at COP29 in Baku, and others would have done here as well. What for you were the big headlines out of Baku that, particularly with a few days to process it now, you know, really seem to have stood out and are particularly relevant for us here in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And I think, so some of you in the room may have been out in Baku, so we're observers to the COP, we're formal observers at the Wildlife Trust, which means we can watch all of the negotiations. Actually, I did that online from home this time. And as many of you are aware, it was branded very much as a finance COP. I would say, compared to some of the previous iterations we've seen over the last few years, it was very single focus. It was a very single agenda focus, and that's quite unusual, actually. And I think the Azerbaijan presidency probably wanted to narrow down what the ambition was to be honest, in what they wanted to achieve. And as we saw, actually, there was quite a bit of disappointment with the outcome. So we saw this new goal for $300 billion of finance being pledged towards developing countries to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change, but also to mitigate as well, to reduce emissions. But they were calling for 1.3 trillion, so it was nowhere near really what the Global South were calling for. And I was looking at the text of that agreement this morning, and it really is very heavily caveated, even for a COP text. And interestingly, there was a lot of references to private finance. So there was obviously a big drive to make sure that the public and private finance balance was in there, but also that there wasn't too much pressure to make sure that money was coming through government funds and public funds, and there was a lot of reference to the global banks as well. So that was quite interesting. So finance, yes, they did get an agreement, and in a way that was positive, because actually right up until the last day, and they ran over as they always do by about 30 hours, I think this time, we weren't sure that they were going to get that agreement. But the other thing that we were really disappointed by with this COP was the lack of reference to nature. And we weren't really expecting it. We weren't very hopeful that we would see that coming through, but we had seen that at probably the 3 previous COPs, particularly in Glasgow, actually COP26, we saw a real drive towards pushing for nature, not so much in the negotiating text, but certainly in the wider discussions in the cover text. And COP27 and COP28 did that as well. But given how close together the 2 COPs were this time, it was disappointing not to see that. But of course, we have Brazil coming up next year, COP30, where the whole emphasis is around nature and climate, which, that is something to look forward to.
Absolutely right. And I'm sure most of you know, but sometimes I get asked whether the word COP, people often talk about COPs as if the only one in town is the climate COP, which really frustrates me, actually. And some people think that COP is an acronym with the word C being climate. It's not at all. Actually, COP, of course, stands for Conference of the Parties to any UN convention. So you have COPs for the Climate Convention, which is the one that gets all the attention, COPs for the Conferences of the Parties for the Nature Convention, and for human rights conventions, and so on as well. But in the last few years, people sort of assumed that the only COP in town are the climate ones, which happen every year. But what also happens once every 2 years are the so-called nature COPs. And because they only happen once every 2 years, that's why we've just had COP16 for nature, and we've just had COP29 on climate, even though they were both launched at the same time at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. So it feels kind of significant, a bit more significant when you have a nature COP. They don't come around every year, they come around every other year. And of course, to have them one after the other was very interesting. So the nature COP happened in Cali, in Colombia, just before the climate COP. Interestingly, it was originally supposed to happen in Turkey, but Turkey then pulled out in hosting it after the appalling earthquake there. And Colombia stepped in and had this framing of saying that it's the Peace with Nature COP, because of course Colombia is really stressing on trying to deliver peace within its own country now after years of turmoil, and was really stressing the role that nature can play in delivering peace. And I think our sense was, the Colombians did a really good job broadly of hosting it. I mean, this could have been a COP16, that was just got a marking time between the big COP15 in Montreal that Claire was talking about before, where the Global Biodiversity Framework was signed, and the next COP, which we now know will be in Armenia, which is really checking in on delivery of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I think the Colombians made sure it was a lot more than just a kind of administrative COP, and put lots of other things on the agenda. And I always go into these things with pretty low expectations, really. I've had too many times in my life I've come back from UN summits very disappointed. So I actually go really disappointed before they start now. And that's much better for my health. And actually, I think there were some interesting things that came out of it, looking at it from low expectations. One, the big heading was, of course, this agreement, albeit voluntary, but nonetheless, around digital sequencing information. So, and actually the UK civil service, if you like, did a really important role in chairing the negotiations on that over a couple of years since Montreal. And this is the idea that if companies make big profits, for example, particularly pharmaceutical companies and so on, out of biodiversity, that is associated with a particular country or community, that they should be able to contribute to a fund to help protect that biodiversity and the indigenous communities look after, which I think seems a very fair kind of approach. But you can imagine the technicalities of how you do that are a little tricky. So that was negotiated. They did get a kind of agreement on that in Cali, which I think there's a lot to work through, how it will be delivered in practice. And as I said, it is voluntary. But I think it's a really important principle, actually, to have been established there. Long way to go yet, but a very important principle on that. Also, the principle that indigenous communities should have a voice at the table in the Nature COP, which was significant. Also, an agreement about how the needs to have better linkages between the Nature Convention and the Climate Convention. I mean, you would have thought that was kind of obvious, but it's taken this long until that was actually written down quite like that. And then finally, also a really interesting set of agreements as well around what they call One Health, so recognising how crucial nature is for protecting and improving people's health. I could give you a long list of all things that I was really disappointed it didn't do, but I think we should also, it's important to put attention on the things it did do.
Yeah, and the role of the UK government actually in both COPs, that was really notable this year. Certainly with the climate COP, we saw obviously speeches being given about the UK's next nationally determined contribution, which is an 81% reduction in emissions by 2035. That's really ambitious. It was great to see that coming forward and being announced early. So the deadline for doing that for countries is next February. So it was good to see that happening. And at COP16, we saw the UK government really stepping up to help with those negotiations on digital sequencing information, among other things. And actually back in Montreal at COP15 as well, we really noticed, and I know Claire did as well, the presence of the UK negotiating team in those discussions. And I used to cover COPs with the UK team 20 years ago, I'm sad to say now. And I always find it really fascinating coming back and looking at them now and looking at the difference from 20 years ago. And actually the climate-nature linkage is not new. So that was being discussed 20 years ago, how the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Convention on Biological Diversity could work better together. But it's been very, very slow. And of course, there's such an enormous space, aren't they, to try and see how those linkages come through. But there are issues like metrics, like measurement, like the science, where really you think we could be doing a lot more than maybe we are to join the two together.
Absolutely. And on that, Kathryn, I mean, you and I debate this a fair bit, but I think you and I agree on this one. I mean, sometimes people say, oh, it's ridiculous that they're separate conventions. Shouldn't they just merge? That would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? I think you and I think that would be an utter disaster, don't we? But maybe explain why. Because on the face of it, it sounds sensible, but why would it be a disaster?
Yeah, having attempted to negotiate at previous COPs, it's so difficult to get through the agenda for any COP. I think trying to merge the two would just make them entirely unmanageable. So it's not something I would ever see governments wanting to do. And because the system is so mature now, it's been in place for 25, 30 years, I think trying to unpick that and dismantle that a bit would probably cause a lot of headaches. But I think it is good to have them separate, but it's good to have the linkages. And there's still a lot of work to do on the linkages, isn't there?
And one other thing, before we go into the panel discussion, you and I debate this a little bit as well. Understandably, there's so much frustration about how slowly these UN processes move. And on the one hand, it is just an agreement. It's trying to get almost 200 countries around the world to agree things by consensus. So I always say, well, it is lowest common denominator, but that's not to knock it. That's just stating the fact. That's what it will always be if you're trying to get 200 countries to agree something. So actually it's even more remarkable when these things are agreed, and it's not where the only game is in town. Actually, we need to deliver it through national action and local action. That's where the real cutting edge stuff happens. And sometimes I worry that people that kind of knock that are trying to be sort of against the international agenda, as it were. But I mean, you think there are opportunities, aren't you, there perhaps to do things differently that might smooth things along and speed things up while still being kind of internationalist in outlook?
Yeah, and I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on this tonight as well. I mean, the climate COPs have grown so enormous that you wonder if really they're now too big and they should scale back a little bit to be more focused on the negotiations. So when I used to attend them as a delegate, there was no business presence at all. we don't want to go back to that, but the biodiversity COPs are probably about half the size of the climate COPs, aren't they? And you kind of think, should there be more focus back on the formal negotiations, and should there be a separate process where civil society and business come together? You know, I could see a lot of benefits of doing that. And there's a lot that goes on that isn't the final text, and a lot actually of the positive action that we see. The mitigation work programme was a good example at COP29, where actually they were saying we almost don't want any text because we're making progress with bringing people together, with convening, with having these discussions. And once you get that text in place, that stops. And they almost felt that they didn't want to get to that point. And having those smaller groups in between COPs, they happen now, but we could see more of that happening, and maybe some smaller groups trying to come up with decisions would make the process a bit easier. But it's a really important process to still support in amongst obviously global action, and actually the action is really the most important thing, as you know, as we all know. So
exactly right. I've always thought these COPs kind of work on 3 different levels. You have like the formal process where you have to try and get 200 countries to agree something that moves at glacier pace, really slow, and then above that you have the bilateral kind of things that happen, and they can be quite significant. So you had like the US and China agree at COP26 in Glasgow, if you remember, the whole approach on methane. That was really significant. And then above that, you have all the voluntary stuff, that what some people kind of call the jamboree. But actually, over time, that kind of trickles down into the bilateral, multilateral agreements, and then ultimately into the formal process. So these things are kind of linked. Very interesting. Anyway, Kathryn, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Very big. You're around afterwards, aren't you? If anyone wants to ask Kathryn really geeky questions about how these things work, Kathryn will be around afterwards. So, and there's nothing she likes talking about more. So please, please give a round of applause to Kathryn. Thank you. So we're going to move into the panel discussion now with some brilliant participants and guests from business. So I'd like to welcome to the stage, please. We've got Anna Swaithes, who's Chief Sustainability Officer here at the Crown Estate. We've got David Croft, who's Group Head of Sustainability at Reckitt. We've got Khadija Ali, who's Group Director Sustainability and Responsible Business at Lloyds Bank. We've got Ben Stone, who's Head of Sustainability at Kier Group. And we've got Laura Spiers, who's Head of Social Impact and ESG at RSA Insurance Group. Please give them a round of applause. So if I can, I'm going to start with each of you in turn with the same big question, please, and just give us your 30-second version of it, or 30-second, maybe 1-minute version of it. We've titled tonight, How Can UK Business Lead in Delivering the Global Biodiversity Framework? This amazing thing that was agreed in Montreal back in 2022 with all lots of targets in it and so on, and very, very ambitious in many respects. In many respects, the targets are stronger than we've got in domestic UK legislation. But I'd love to hear just your thought. What's the kind of conditions that are needed? What's the context that's needed to enable UK business to lead in delivering that, or indeed on the climate commitments as well? And Anna, maybe I can start with you first, as you're the host, so as Chief Sustainability Officer at the Crown Estate.
Brilliant, thank you, Craig. And it's great to see everyone here tonight. Welcome again. So I guess my short version of that, I really, really like to reach to the framework developed by the Transition Plan Task Force. I find it really useful. The ambition, action, accountability framing. I think it's, and I can talk a bit more later on about sort of how we're sort of thinking and acting in those terms. But I think what that helps with is keeping focused on, like, what's the big vision? How do we align to what some of the targets and goals are that are set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework? But then really recognise that when it comes, a lot of the role of business is then to act, it's to deliver, it's to show how we can actually make progress, how we can do that working with others, and to be really accountable. And accountability is about transparency, and in the case of the nature arena, I think transparency is also about making yourself somewhat vulnerable, because it's such an ambiguous, uncertain, fast-moving space that actually to be accountable is to be accountable to something that you haven't even quite sized and shaped the beast yet. So I guess if I were to add Transition Plan Task Force was about climate. If I were to add my version for nature, I'd add some C's to it around sort of courage and collaboration and connectedness, and say you need to really be able to step into that sort of softer skill space and actually be prepared to connect and collaborate and have the courage to put yourself out there to try and drive forward.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And David, what about you as Group Head of Sustainability at Reckitt? And I'm sure people will know Reckitt, and if they don't, they will certainly know your brands.
Yes, they will know the brands. Thank you, Craig. I think when I look at this from the perspective of Reckitt and also as being on the TNFD task force, and I think for me the critical conversation is that we start to progressively put nature on the balance sheet in a way that has not happened, and that we've taken nature for granted for far too many years. And I speak, from a business point of view, but also I think we can say that as a personal point of view. We take for granted that you turn the tap on and water comes out.
I'm going to ask you if you can briefly just explain what TNFD is. I mean, everyone here tonight will probably know that, but not everyone maybe watch on YouTube.
So the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure and the risks associated in global value chains for your organization from nature and biodiversity loss. And when we look at it from the perspective of Reckitt, we identified very quickly that this is not a conversation about risk. This should be a conversation about resilience. And whether you have a way of looking at those global value chains that we're part of, where we have sites located, where the natural raw materials like latex that we depend upon come from, and whether we understand the risks that we face. But not to manage this in the context of risk. Risk for me is a race to the bottom in terms of investment. Reframe that conversation, reframe it in terms of resilience, and then start to think, as Anna says, how do you work outside of the factory gates to think about what is our role in stimulating a much more resilient landscape, which we are one of the ecosystem service beneficiaries of. And so, from a Reckitt point of view, that transpires in a number of ways. It means that when we think about where we'll put a new factory in India, for example, the first question that was written down was, will there be water here in 25 years' time? Because it might be the best location for logistics. There might be various great reasons from a workforce point of view. But if there isn't water there, then we can't run that factory. And Dettol, critical as it is to many people's health and well-being, has a large amount of water as its biggest ingredient. So thinking about resilience in that context reframes how you manage your use of water inside the factory, but also how you relate to the landscape that you're part of, and how you create shared approaches within that catchment that builds resilience into your business, to the catchment, and to the communities that you're part of. Business can't stand in splendid isolation. It has to, as Anna was saying, collaborate and engage with lots of other people to make that ecosystem, that landscape, function really effectively. And then a final point is, in the adage of business, what gets measured gets done. Work out how you're going to measure your impact and the other impacts on that landscape, and then start to drive interventions, because that's when business becomes super powerful in creating change and driving positive impact that builds resilience for everybody.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. So we've done buildings and land, we've done consumer products. Let's go to banking. And Khadija, you're Group Director, Sustainability and Responsible Business at Lloyds Bank. Ask you this question again: how can UK business lead in delivering the Global Biodiversity Framework?
And I'll probably copy a little bit off of my previous panelist, but I think setting a little bit of context from a UK perspective, I think, is important as well here. This is an economic imperative for us. When we look at the UK, it is one of the most nature-depleted economies in the world. We are the lowest from a G7 perspective. So we've got a really challenging position to start with. And I think seeing it in that economic imperative landscape is incredibly important. I think the approaches that have been outlined are incredibly helpful, and they kind of come down in my way in two approaches, which is what we're looking at from Lloyds Banking Group. The first is a top-down view. So when we talk about COPs and the kind of national strategies, we absolutely need our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, right, our NBSAP. That is, I would say, the kind of top layer to which, from a UK standpoint, we are going to commit to, and that's going to be a kind of guiding force of the direction of travel. That's helpful, but then it's not enough. So that bottoms-up view is where we as industry, so financial services, cross-sector, really then get into the details of what are we going to then drive from a private financing perspective, from a partnership and a collaboration standpoint. And this is something from a Lloyd's banking group, we're trialing a number of partnerships and pilots, all small scale at the moment, because we do need to see where this develops from a UK standpoint. But nonetheless, it's important to then get on the ground and get our hands dirty in the kind of simple way to understand where are the dependencies on nature, what are the impacts. So that kind of top-down view will help set the scene, but it's really important to drive that collaboration. I think in closing, to the point Anna raised, and someone said this is where we need to put our competitive advantages aside and actually form really effective partnerships and models that can be duplicated across the industry. And I think this is where we should start to engage and understand how do we work together around the restoration of nature as a whole for the UK.
Great, thanks very much. And so, Ben, I'll come to you as Group Head of Sustainability at Kier Group. Again, in construction sector, how can that sector lead in delivering the Global Biodiversity Framework?
Yeah, I'm going to borrow again quite a lot from what everybody said. You won't be surprised to hear. But I've got 3 C's as well, and they're slightly different. So maybe we'll compare later. So my first, though, is kind of an ask for what business needs. So I think business needs confidence. We need confidence in what's coming and foresight of what's coming, because then we can plan and we can invest. And there's some really great examples of this where government got it right. So biodiversity net gain, great example, involved business in the development of it. We all got on board, we all knew what we had to achieve, and it went perfectly. Nutrient neutrality, on the other hand, completely left field. Nobody saw it coming. House builders had made investment decisions on land, and then overnight it felt like those were undermined. So if we have confidence in what's coming, that will really help. And then how do we kind of accelerate and remain a leader? So I've got 2 C's on this one as well. First one is collaboration. Everybody said it. We all need to collaborate for innovation. So doing what we've always done will get what we've always got. And we need to collaborate on innovation because it's risky and it's costly and it fails quite a lot of the time. And if we collaborate at scale, we actually have the chance of being able to deliver that effectively and speedily. And then my second part on that is a bit like what I'm asking of government in terms of certainty. Our supply chains all ask us to say we need consistency of focus. So Kier is one large construction firm. 60% of our spend is with SMEs, and they don't have in-house teams that work on nature or on climate. And what they want from us is for us to all ask the same thing and ask them at the same speed. And if we do that, they all say, yes, we know what we've got to deliver. We know what we've got to work on. We can do that. If we all ask them 25 different things at different times of the year, they don't stand a chance. So for me, the 3 things are confidence in what's coming, collaboration with our clients, with our peers, with our investors, with our suppliers, and then a consistency of focus right across our sector so that we're all pushing in the same direction. And that's the way we'll accelerate.
Great, Ben, thank you very much. Very useful thoughts there. Laura, let me come to you, Head of Social Impact and ESG at RSA Insurance Group. No one would have missed the very wild weather weekend we had just now. And look, you're still smiling. That's interesting. But it does feel on a regular basis now that we're feeling the impacts of certainly climate change, but actually also increasingly some of the nature crises as well. So this must be a really important area for you guys to be leading into. And again, the question: how can UK business lead on Global Biodiversity Framework?
Yeah, maybe I'll come back to some of those recent impacts in the global and the UK perspective. But in terms of the 1 minute and the answer on that, I'll try and build probably on what everyone else has said, because I don't think there's anything particularly new. But I think for us, it is around building resilient communities, as David pointed out, and climate resilience being a key part. But mainstreaming nature into that consideration of climate change. So for us, around nature-based solutions and what they can offer, we act as a convener and an influencer of a number of other organisations. So whether it's brokers in our network, we have 3,000 brokers across the UK, or our commercial customers. And we're pretty well advanced on climate change adaptation and mitigation, and asking key questions there, more from a risk management perspective, it's true, but equally from an opportunity perspective, certainly when it comes to products and service innovation. And I think we have a role to play on the nature side to ask those same kind of provocations and questions, because it does get people thinking differently about these topics. And then I think secondly, using our influence in collaboration with partners and working together. So the insurance sector isn't going to solve it on its own. The public sector is not going to solve it on its own. Utility companies, FMCG goods companies, construction companies, we all come at it from a slightly different angle. And I think working with environmental NGOs like yourselves as well gives us that different perspective and the thinking that we all need to come up with different ways of looking at the same problem. And I think, all of that comes together. And the third thing I'd say is around that discipline and measurement, because nature is more complex to measure and manage than climate is in reality. I think we've all got our heads around carbon emissions, maybe not everything in scope 3, but or a long, long way down that path. But when you think about nature, and as an insurance company, we love data, we love risk modelling, we just don't have that information currently to, price the risk and build it into our models. So we need to see that changing, and I think it becomes a stronger narrative when you can communicate the impact that has as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Anna, I'll come back to you if I can, please. I mean, because with the Crown Estate, you're a business with responsibility for in urban areas, in rural areas, coastal, marine holdings. You're very much obviously engaged in offshore wind because you own the seabed and so on, agriculture, built environment and so on. So, that's a huge range of areas and contexts in which to try and deliver infrastructure in a nature positive way.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. And it would be worth me just stepping back for a minute, perhaps, to elaborate on what you said about the kind of sheer breadth of the assets that we're both privileged but also very responsible to steward. And I'm really conscious some of you here might know us for nothing more than this building that you're sitting in tonight. But part of I guess you can think about our portfolio as sea, land and city. And the city part is in part London, this building, the sort of beautiful sweep of Regent Street, but urban assets across other parts of the UK as well. The land part, and I guess one of the sort of real cores of the Crown Estate, you might know us for Windsor Great Park. And I mean, Windsor Great Park, if you go there and look up around you at the majestic trees, some of them date back to the 8th century, you can sort of see and feel and breathe nature in, but it's also an attraction. It's also somewhere that attracts millions of visitors. I think over 6 million visitors a year. So we have to very carefully balance the sort of nature and people impacts there. And that sits at the heart of a wider rural portfolio of about 200,000 acres of land. And then we have the sea part of our portfolio, which, as Craig says, the seabed, also a large part of the foreshore and a coastal portfolio. And there, yes, it's sort of at the forefront of the renewable energy transition, but it's much more than that too. I mean, it's a natural asset, and so we're very much in the space of how does nature sit alongside net zero as twin priorities, but it's also the source of livelihoods for many coastal communities. It's if we think about the digital revolution, where do we think all of the cables that are fueling that are coming from across the seabed? It's a very busy space. So what approach are we taking? Well, it's not sort of nature alongside all that. It's how do we put nature through all of that? How do we think about nature sort of, David talked about nature on the balance sheet. And, in traditional terms, we would talk about our balance sheet valued in the way the economy traditionally would value real estate assets. Moving forward, where we need to get to is a place where we really value those natural assets as some of the most precious assets that society has, and take our responsibility for stewarding those that seriously. And so what we're really working to do across all of those parts of our portfolio is to make sure that we, and I'll come perhaps a bit later on to sort of specific goals that we've set out, but to really make sure that we're thinking at the kind of, at the ambition level, at the system level, if you like, and really contributing to building an evidence base on which good decisions can be taken by us and by others. And a great example of that is our whole of seabed work, which is about really mapping the whole of the UK seabed, for which we don't take all of the decisions or all the calls on what happens where, but we have got the ability to provide an evidence base that enables robust decisions to be taken by us and others about how to meet those kind of potentially competing, but we hope complementary demands. And we believe that if we provide that evidence base, there's a route through where it can serve all of those needs, the needs of energy and food and local communities, as well as restoring and protecting it as a natural asset. And we're applying that same sort of mindset in our rural portfolio, really thinking about how land is used, how our land is used, and how we contribute to catalysing, I guess, a shift in agricultural practices that enables nature and food to coexist, not to compete. And then in our urban portfolio as well, we can't think about building or nature. We have to think about nature as the foundation, the raw material that we're working with, the ecosystem services that the people who live and work in these cities are going to depend on for generations to come. So how do we plan for those ecosystems and plan for nature as part of the way that we do development? So sort of really working to put it through the grain, through the core of everything we do, based on understanding a wider system level and then really acting on that insight. So we're not there yet. We've got a long way to go. I won't pretend that we have it all perfect, but that's the sort of route that we're on in the way that we're working.
Thank you, Anna. And to crystallise, it really sounds like it's about integrating these different issues rather than seeing them as all separate.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have, in the way that so nature has been for us one of 4 priorities for a number of years already, and we've really been then working to crystallise some concrete goals and commitments, and they thread right across our business so that we're being consistent in the way that we seek to understand nature, the way we seek to partner with others, the way we sort of seek to use our funding and catalyse funds from others, the way we kind of design into our leasing approaches, our development approaches, and so on. So we take consistent approaches, but obviously context-specific, place-specific. Yeah. And we're very conscious of the need to, really balance the national and the local, because in the end, nature is incredibly local, as all of us know when we walk out the door each morning, right? So yeah. We're trying to apply those common themes and common principles, but really make sure that they're system, sector, place-specific in the way they show up.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to jump around in the order a little bit here. I'll come to you next, Ben, if I can, because obviously as a construction company and this Labour government is committed to building, unleashing lots of new infrastructure and building 1.5 million homes and all these kind of things. And certainly as the Wildlife Trust, we've been quite pleased with the conversations we've been having with the Secretary of State, Steve Reed, and Ed Miliband and so on about integrating these concerns, but did rather hear something slightly different in tone from the Prime Minister on Thursday, which sort of seemed to, I'm going to ask Toby Perkins this question as well later, is his job as a politician to particularly answer, but, how did, obviously there's a lot of work being done in the construction sector over many years at looking at how to integrate these issues rather than trade off environment and infrastructure. What was your readout of that speech and the sort of mood on that?
So, I think it's really challenging. We have so many societal and environmental challenges that are coming at us. So we've got food security. We need land for that. We need more houses, and we need more affordable houses, to put a point on it. We need to make sure that nature is in recovery. We need to adapt to climate change. We have all of these challenges coming all at once, and we've got to find a way to work through it. So I kind of think that it's going to be a difficult time, and there are going to be trade-offs. And Claire said we need climate and nature recoupling. I think slightly different, I'm afraid. So I think we need a sustainability net gain. So we have to think and we have to assess all of those issues together and then try and get to the best solution that comes out. Because that's the only way we're going to get real value. If we think about things in isolation, it's never going to work. And I think what makes that a little bit harder for businesses is that we've kind of picked the low-hanging fruit. So energy efficiency, the things that pay for themselves, they're gone. We're going to have to start shaking the tree now to be able to get anything more out of it. And that means picking a different way of working, thinking about innovation, and I came to this in the previous answer, but collaborating more. So we've got to learn quickly, and we've got to learn together. It's the only way we're actually going to achieve it. And I think we've kind of seen that sustainable net gain piece coming through a couple of times now. So biodiversity net gain, big thing for the construction sector, clearly. Know quite a lot about it. We struggle a little bit with biodiversity net gain. I think it's a great policy, by the way. I'm not trying to have a pop at it. But if you think about brownfield development, big focus from the government on brownfield development, absolutely the right thing to do, everybody would say. Brownfield sites contaminated, often got derelict buildings on them, but they are also often left alone for 20 years. And when you leave a site alone, nature moves in. So they've got this massive biodiversity baseline a lot of the time. And when you've already got extremely high development costs to regenerate that land, get rid of the contamination, knock down those derelict buildings, you add biodiversity on top of that. And a lot of the time, it's cheaper to build on an arable field in a green belt. So we have this counterpoint where we need to work out how do we actually make economically feasible decisions that also work for sustainability. So we need that financial sustainability, that social sustainability, and that environmental sustainability all brought together.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really important point that a lot of so-called brownfield land is actually really important for nature, has become so over the last few years, and really valued by local communities. So these are, whatever happens, you need to be guided by the science and understand how important a particular site is for nature. That's going to be part of the debate. Khadija, often I hear about but I'm often told there's no shortage of money out there to invest in all of this, in climate solutions and nature solutions. I don't always feel it though. What's holding back at the moment? What would you say? What's needed now to really unlock the billions, the trillions that's needed to be invested in, and is there in terms of private finance just waiting to help solve the nature and climate crisis? What's needed to boost that confidence for investors?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question we often get, as a financial institution, and I always try and simplify it to say, we need economic flywheels, as I call them. So when we look at solutions or technology solutions that have come in the past, what's been there has been an ideation that's formed into a solution that's resulted in a scalable outcome that's been able to deliver and challenge us against the kind of alternative. So for me, solar is always the easiest example to come with, right? There was a point where it was an ideation. It's now cheaper than gas. The modular nature of solar allows you to use it, scale it, and deliver, quite rapidly. For financial services, we need similar solutions. We need the ability to take outcomes, be able to invest in them, recognize failure, but not at the cost to stakeholders or shareholders, because we do have that responsibility to the economy. And that requires a strong policy structure. It requires an economic policy that allows for innovation and development, and it allows for the ability to test and learn and then scale. While it's probably not a popular opinion for the room, but this is where I have to say, the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act, has actually been quite instrumental in building out an industrial policy that builds across the value chain, drives industrial growth, and actually incentivizes the focus on sustainability. And people always call it the kind of Climate Act, but actually when you look at the framework for the IRA, it's not centered on climate. That's the outcome, but that's driving economic resilience. It's driving, energy diversification, so the fundamentals that we want. So it is really important that when we look at solutions, we have a policy environment that enables that innovation. We then fuel that through growth, and then we kind of look to deliver that. Now, like I said earlier, from our standpoint at Lloyd's, we are looking at this also in a systems-based approach. I think that's incredibly important. Anna mentioned that up front. And when we look at the challenges that we're facing across nature, we've kind of structured it in a way where we have 4 core systems. We talk about the built environment. We talk about food and farming. We talk about low-carbon transport. And I think looking across all of these systems, we need to know that we're not just tackling climate, we're tackling nature, but we're also tackling societal issues as well. So it's people, planet, and the kind of wider economy as well. So I think that that model is really, really important to embed in. The last thing I'll say here in that, channeling that financial outcome, we have seen incentive structures, we have seen policies that work. It is going to take a whole economy approach. I know it's really easy to kind of land it on the financial services, but we need industries to be ready. We need supply chains to be present. We can give out all the kind of options and incentives, but if the industries are not there to support that, it's really challenging then to actually deliver on that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, some really good thoughts there. David, I'll come back to you. You were talking before about how it's important to move from thinking about a risk framing to a resilience framing. What would you say? What more does it take to then, for a business like yours, to really see it as an opportunity to deliver on things like the Global Biodiversity Framework or indeed these climate targets?
I think it's driven by the fact that there won't be one single value point that drives this conversation from a business point of view. And while perhaps regulation, reporting, disclosure lines things up around carbon and then nature and many other things, sometimes whilst that drives a certain type of approach, maybe it focuses a little bit more on compliance and risk. What it doesn't necessarily do is incentivize you to join it up, because what we actually need is a much more joined up solution where, as we were hearing earlier from your conversation with Kathryn, the conversation about climate and nature is conjoined. And so what we've started to think about is really how do you craft solutions that work at multiple levels? When we began to measure the state of nature in some of the landscapes we operate in, we partnered with a fabulous team at Nature Based Insights in Oxford about how you measure the state of nature. But then from that, we're able to model solutions that are about biodiversity, but are also about carbon and climate change solutions. So now it's a conversation with farmers in that landscape about not how they can farm better and more productively with less impact on nature, but how they can encourage and strengthen biodiversity and at the same time create carbon assets, which are very valuable from their point of view and from our point of view. And it changes the dynamic in terms of how you think about, shall we say, land productivity. In the past, this was a commodity. This is latex. This might have been about, what is the price of latex? It's a pure commodity. It's almost interchangeable. It's no longer interchangeable when you add in value from nature-related mitigation and opportunity and carbon. The farmers, particularly smallholders in this case, start to differentiate. They start to decommoditize. And there's a lot of study at the moment that is demonstrating that that increases the land value for them as well. And so you get an awful lot of net gain. But in order to see that from a business point of view, you have to lift yourself above, am I solving for one solution, nature, one solution for climate and carbon, and even one solution for socioeconomic value. And that needs a much higher profile within any organization to recognize and join it up. So you avoid silo budgeting that drives a certain compliance-led, cost-related behavior. Building resilience has to be a total organizational conversation. But if you can find that way of joining those 2-3 things up effectively, you create a super resilient value chain that is not just beneficial to people like me at one part of that value chain, but hugely beneficial, in that case, to smallholder farmers who have been struggling in a global commodity supply network for many, many years. And that's creating a step change approach. And that's the way I think you can really drive new opportunities and see land in a very different way than we've perhaps seen it before, proverbially putting nature on the balance sheet, as I said earlier.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. Very interesting. I'll be coming out to you very shortly to ask if there's any couple of questions, 2 or 3 questions in the audience. But just before we do that, Laura, we can't finish without me inviting you to talk a bit about the work you've been doing with the Wildlife Trusts as RSA Insurance in actually exploring with Wildlife Trust the potential for natural flood management. Just how's that been going, and what have you as RSA learned from that?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So our perspective on this is that climate adaptation is as urgent, if not more critical, than emissions reductions, given everything that's going on and the fact that we're not on track to hit those emissions reductions currently. So we kind of asked ourselves the question, how could we combine climate adaptation and nature-based solutions, and where could we work? So the projects that we've been doing in Gloucestershire and Cheltenham have focused on things like wetland creation, slowing the flow of water through the catchment, storing it where we can, and reducing peak floods so that, to protect the resilience of businesses and infrastructure, which, if you've tried to travel around the UK this last few weeks, has been very challenging with Storm Berre. If anyone uses Great Western Railways, I certainly do, and it's been demonstrating that 2/3 of the UK infrastructure is at risk of flooding, and we expect that risk to double by 2050. The other thing we've been trialling is more sustainable urban drainage solutions. So this is surface water flooding. So less of the natural catastrophe end of the spectrum, but more the secondary perils that we see. And obviously surface water flooding can affect people and businesses no matter where they are. So things like rain gardens, things like depaving projects, and creating habitat in more urban environments as well. Then we were kind of saying, actually, why isn't more of this happening? And it's because I think there's a lack of the measurement piece and the knowledge piece. It's quite fragmented currently. So, if you take something like leaky dams, it might happen kind of piecemeal here and there. You might need 80 in a catchment before you really see the impact on flooding. So we've been working with the Wildlife Trust centrally on a project to assess the kind of co-benefits of nature-based solutions, not just for climate, but also for people and for nature. And there's some really interesting stuff. So we've taken a sample of projects from across the country where there have been things like wetland, salt marsh, beaver restoration in Devon. And what we've looked at is what are the economic benefits that come to that, not only from a flood alleviation perspective, but also from water quality or habitat creation, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, mental health benefits, opportunities to engage the public in nature and bring them closer to it. And we've seen that, for every £1 invested, the benefit over 10 years is about £4, and over 30 years is about £10. So there is a clear case around this. I think the challenge is communicating that and engaging people in it and making the connection to the activity that they can do on the ground to drive a real change.
Great, thank you very much. Great to hear that. And it's so funny when you talk about the need for sort of 80 leaky dams in a catchment. I'm thinking there's an animal that would do that for free. We just need to get it out there. We really hope the government will decide to allow free roaming beavers sooner rather than later. This has been talked about now for about 5 years, and it still hasn't happened. It's quite extraordinary. So we'd love to see that happen sooner rather than later. Anyway, we've got time for just 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Just wondering if anyone particularly bursting to ask one to our amazing panel. Just pop your hand up if so. We've got a microphone runner. Yeah, there's a lady there in a white top. Thank you. Maybe you can just say who you are.
My name's Isabel. I come from Cambridge Consultants, a technology company. My question's for David. I wondered, you were talking about mostly resilience, and I guess that's the sort of impact of nature on your business. But you also talked about the sort of total organisational transformation for resilience. So I wondered how much you're including kind of innovation in your products and in your packaging to be part of your nature strategy, and things like, I don't know, cleaning products where you can add water in the home rather than shipping that, things like that. Is that part of your strategy, or is that quite separate at the moment?
No, it's an integrated part of it. I mean, we have operated for about the last 10 years a sustainable innovation calculator that measures the footprint of all new product innovations. It bases it on what's the carbon footprint, the water footprint, the packaging footprint, the chemistry footprint, and we incentivize people to improve that time after time with a corporate goal of hitting 50% of net revenue for more sustainable products by the end of the decade. We're currently in excess of 30%. the secret is finding ways to unlock that and finding new approaches, because once you've gone around that cycle once, you think you've perhaps exploited all of the opportunities. What we're finding is that there's more and more opportunities, and it's finding creative ways of using materials, changing towards green chemistry, thinking about the origins of raw materials, but also thinking what people want, and also using the strength of those brands to nudge and influence as well. I mean, if I take a brand like Finish, I'm going to ask a pointed question of the audience. How many people pre-rinse their dishes before you put it in the dishwasher? Nobody wants to own up to that. Well, there's no need to. And if you don't, you can save 40 to 50 litres of water every time, plus the energy associated with that, plus the fact that we're using potable water to run that in this country, as most people are. So if you start to think about how we can not just innovate our products, but nudge the 30 million households that we put our products into every day, then the opportunities are significant, and that's how we try and run both product development and brand activation together.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'll come to you in a second, but there's another question. Is there another question about the back? I saw. No. The gentleman down here then.
That's great. Some amazing points from the panel, and I'm guilty. I just can't get out of the habit. My wife tells me off every single time in deep frustration. I think really interesting about the point that if we look at England, we've got B&G. What came out of Colombia and the COP out there about nature, the world is now looking at England about B&G. First regulated market, whether we like it or don't like it. That gives us the opportunity to create a voluntary sector around resilience, robustness, confidence against an agreed metric, and then make sure we don't repeat all the mistakes of what happened around carbon and the voluntary markets. If we can keep that integrity, we have a real opportunity, not just for England, for the UK, to really, demonstrate to the world that this is possible. The big challenge that we have is, how do you get businesses to be brave enough to make the first step? We've got a 500-acre project up at Castle Howard. We're putting in beavers. They can take up to 50 beavers up there on Bog Farm. But your point about collaboration, how can we get UK businesses or the financial sector or the FMCG sector to come together and make a real statement in the UK that the world then looks at and says, this is possible and it's been done? That will just swing the whole thing, not just in the UK, but across Europe.
I should have got you to introduce yourself. You're with Environment Bank, aren't you?
I'm
So,
Environment.
so I was saying. Ben, do you want to have a crack at that first?
So there's lots of collaboration going on already, I think. So we've adopted TNFD. It was announced at Cali, so we're one of the 68 or so UK businesses now that have done that. I think that's great. A lot of our peers have signed up to be nature positive or to the nature positive agreements. And in the construction sector, certainly, we come together as large construction companies through an organisation called the Supply Chain Sustainability School. So I chair the nature group there, I'm on the board. But we have had some really great meetings where we've sat together and we've said, okay, so we will undermine each other if we all go off in different directions. We have to do this together, and we have to work out how we're going to achieve that. So we talk about things like land use change. How do we measure it? What's in our gift to change? What's outside of the boundaries where we can change? It's sort of almost a scope 1, 2, 3 for land use change. We do things for our clients, but we don't necessarily have any design responsibility for it. So how do we include that in our disclosure and reporting? How do we measure it properly? Those sort of parallel alignments, whether it's TNFD or nature positive, they're all pushing in the same direction. It also gives the same message. For me, I think I kind of touched on this. We need to bring the smaller businesses with us. That's what's going to make the difference. It's okay for half a dozen, 20, 30, 40 construction companies that are large across the UK making that commitment, but we need to bring our supply chains with us. And that's where we need to make it simple and explain to them how they can actually contribute to it as well.
Great, thank you. Khadija.
Yeah, I'm going to use a really simplified word, but we spent a fair bit of time looking at carbon markets and nature markets, and the word is trust. We need an operational system that allows for trust, right? When we look at this from Lloyd's Banking Group, hopefully some customers out there, the view is you trust us. You trust us with your money. You trust that when you put money in to the bank, it will stay with the bank. You'll be able to access it. When we're looking at things like carbon markets or nature-based markets, the challenge is it's really difficult to look at what is high integrity. You know, where is the money flowing? What is the use of proceeds? It's a complicated ecosystem. It's a complicated landscape. It's getting even more complicated when we add nature into the mix. So I think we need in the UK a structure that allows for this to be a market that the individuals can, you know, the average investor or the average individual can trust and understand. And I think that becomes particularly acute when we're thinking about, you know, nature-based markets or nature-based solutions for farmers and the, you know, the average individual when we're looking at their income and their ability to operate on a day-to-day basis. So I think that trust piece is incredibly important. I think we're seeing signals of that off the back of Baku with the ratification around Article 6.4, with 6.2. So the stepping stones are there, but you're right. I think there's an opportunity here to say, how do we lead in that respect, but build a market of trust?
Thank you. And I go back to Anna on this as well. Just I'm sure you're bursting, but I'll come back to you on another question a bit. Anna.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. In many ways, we're, I guess, addressing the question on BNG, but also the wider point around nature and carbon markets. In many ways, we're quite fortunate because we have in our portfolio many of the ingredients, or if you like, both sides of, if you think BNG, both sides of the coin. We're also quite fortunate that we're an independent business. We exist with a long-term remit, well, it's up here on the screen, to create lasting and shared prosperity for the nation. So we have an ability to take a degree of long-term view and risk that others might not. That means, therefore, not that we're working through, okay, so how do we sort of play the BNG game within our portfolio, and how do we do things that others can't? It means, I think, that we have the ability to pilot things within our portfolio and to look at them, back to this point about the systems view, to look at them from the point of view of the system and understand, right, so what would it take to scale that? So we've done some pilots in our rural portfolio looking at what biodiversity net gain might mean from a farm point of view and understanding, and created an environment fund so that we can directly fund some of the steps that it might take in the sort of near term, but actually seek to understand what would it take to go to scale there. And on the sort of marine side of our business, and I think one of the things that's kind of missing from the nature markets debate is the kind of bringing together of marine and terrestrial and figuring out, you know, we need to think about all of it, right? Not just what happens. Too often the debates about the farming sector and land and the marine bit's missing. So we've co-commissioned some research there with a number of partners, including Blue Marine Foundation and Esme Fairbairn and Finance Earth and others, looking at, well, what would high integrity natural capital markets in the marine space look like? And I think then there's a really interesting opportunity to start to bring some of those threads of insight and research together and look at exactly that question of what might a really high integrity approach for the UK nationally look like that delivers in multiple sectors. But fundamentally at the heart of it is evidence-based and is around outcomes for nature first, and then how do markets come in and how do streams of funding come in to deliver those outcomes for nature, rather than sort of the other way around. So that's sort of how we're approaching it and seeking to experiment and test and hopefully offer up something that's of value in answering that question.
Okay, thanks, Anna. David, you want to come in briefly?
Just super briefly, I think the answer lies in actually rethinking how we look at the landscape and think about how do you map all of the beneficiaries, the ecosystem service beneficiaries of that landscape, and then join them up. And I don't just mean those people who maybe take a very visible output from it, but some of the invisible benefits, as we were hearing earlier, you know, natural flood risk management creates a net benefit. We are awful at coordinating and then organising those ecosystem service beneficiaries. There's a role for civil society and government and the private sector in doing so. But if we can do that successfully, then I think we will create the model of the UK being a really leading force in that collaboration.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for one more very quick question. Go on, Lamé.
So more of a curious question. We live in a very wet country. So my name is Lamé Verre. Why don't we have a policy on rainwater harvesting?
Why don't we have a policy on rainwater harvesting? I think I have to come to you for that. I mean, insurance,
I'm not sure
would
about.
help,
I
wouldn't
mean, we do live in a wet country. Flood risk is probably one of the biggest risks to the UK, and costs certainly from an insurance perspective, the most of any of the insured losses that we occur in a year. But obviously, with climate change, we will see not only warmer, wetter winters, but hotter, drier summers, and drought resilience and drought mitigation. There's a role to be played there as well in terms of how individual behaviours link into the bigger picture, and certainly where individuals can make a difference by rainwater harvesting, or businesses, warehouses, etc., use that. I think it comes down to what are you using that water for, and where there's a demand and a need and it makes sense to do so, then it's a brilliant way. If you need a potable water source, or you don't have the high demand for it, then it doesn't make sense. But others might have a different perspective on harvesting.
It's a really good question. I think that's kind of where we've run out of time, though, now, really, pretty much. And unless we're bursting, no. I think we're pretty much out of time on that now, so we're running a bit behind. But it's a key question. If the government is going to build 1.5 million homes, there's big questions to ask about, are they all going to have solar roofs or green roofs? Are they all going to have rainwater harvesting? Where they're going to be built, of course, to what standards, which materials, energy insulation standards, and so on. We could do this right, or we could do this very badly in the years ahead. So, key question. Look, I want to say a huge thank you to our brilliant panel here. Please give them a round of applause. It's Anna, David, Khadija, Ben, and Laura. Thank you very much, and do take your seats. So I'll invite Toby, if you're happy to go to that one, and then I'll go here, Lamé, and then you can go. So, does that work? Yeah, you go there. That'd be great. So thank you very much for those questions as well. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more, but I do want to welcome to the stage. Well, first of all, welcome my co-host. Let's do my co-host first, Lamé Verre, who's the Crown Estate's Net Zero Sustainability Director, and also on the board with me at Green Alliance. And we met earlier for the. We've had one board meeting together, haven't we? And I was on Teams for that on the wall, and you were there in person. So it's very nice to actually meet in person tonight. Lamé, thanks so much for joining us and co-hosting tonight. Do you want to just say a little bit about your role here at the Crown Estate?
So my role. Can you hear me? All right, so I'm the director for Net Zero across the enterprise, so looking after our portfolio, land, sea, and urban. And the whole idea there is how we decarbonize our portfolio, but also contributing to the UK Net Zero and energy security. So, yeah, good to see all of you, and good evening.
Thanks very much. Thanks for joining. And we're going to do this like daytime TV. We're co-hosts here.
Cop, bad cop.
For Toby, yeah. But very, very pleased that Toby Perkins could join us tonight. Toby, you're MP for Chesterfield in Derbyshire. And I've known you for a wee while. You came into Parliament, 2010, wasn't it? That's right. And you've all long had an interest in these kind of issues, climate and nature. And you're now, did I say, chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. And maybe we should start by you just explaining what it means to be chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, because not everyone would necessarily understand that, and your role in looking out across Parliament and actually across the benches there in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Environmental Audit Committee plays a unique role within the Parliamentary Select Committees. The vast majority of select committees in Parliament shadow a particular department and look at the policies of that department, identify areas I think open to question and scrutinise ministers. The role of the Environmental Audit Committee is to look across every department in terms of the environmental consequences of that department. So whilst there is particular sort of focus around probably DEFRA and the Department for Energy and Net Zero, the Environmental Audit Select Committee can look at the policies not only of government departments, but how that areas of policy are impacting on the environmental commitments that we've made as a country. And a great example of that is the first inquiry that we're looking at, and it's relevant to some that we've been talking about today, which is, what impact the government's planning reforms and house building targets are going to have on the environment, on our environmental commitments. And the lead department there will be the Department for Housing and Local Government. And so we will be trying to make sure that where individual departments have their own areas of priority, and clearly the Housing Department's key priority at the moment is build 1.5 million more houses, that they don't lose sight of the environmental targets and commitments that the government's made.
Absolutely, Toby. Thank you very much. So quickly, before I hand over to you for your question, I just want to say the last time Toby and I saw each other was in Cali at the Nature COP in Colombia, and I'd love to know what did you make of it when you got back home afterwards? What was your overall impressions of that particular COP?
Well, I mean, I think that overall that Cali was a disappointment. I think that there was the agreement that was made in terms of contribution towards the IP coming out of nature and biodiversity usage, but I think the failure to reach the financial agreement was a huge disappointment. This was always supposed to be the conference at which there was delivery on the commitments that had previously been made, and I think in financial terms that didn't happen. I think it is a disappointment to the UK government that it didn't happen. I don't believe that we were a blocker there. I think our government was one of those that was pushing as hard as possible to get an economic agreement. But I think we heard while we were there from many indigenous peoples and the impact that nature and biodiversity loss was having on them, and also the extent to which their own economies were dependent on support from the West to be the custodians of these crucial global resources. So, I think that there was a lot of excitement going into this conference, and so I think overall my reflection on Cali will be that it's a disappointment.
Okay, thank you. Lamé, over to you.
All right, thanks. So I haven't been to COP29 myself in Baku, and it was termed the finance COP, and given that Cali timed out. So sitting back here in the UK, I think my question is really around from a marine sector, because we do look after the seabed. How do we ensure that your committee, when people bring topics that, we are not only focusing on the land nature-based solutions, but how do we leverage the marine sector as well in terms of creating those nature-based solutions and creating the financial benefit for the nation?
Well, I mean, it is a hugely important one, and I think that the solutions are global, but I think we also do need to have UK leadership. I think that when it comes to some aspects of the environment and nature, that the UK has been a global leader. I think that the COP29 conference was a different one. The financial agreement was made there, but the emissions agreement wasn't. And so I think that was also kind of a mixed bag. I think that the whole question of nature from a marine perspective, heading towards the Global Oceans Treaty in June is an incredibly important one, and I think it's a one that hasn't had enough focus. Watch this space, but I expect my select committee might well be looking to do some work around oceans and the marine environment.
Okay, so if we stay on that for a little bit, sorry, I've just got my follow-up, because I think, the UK's position and presence at COP29 was highly commended from a leadership perspective, but coming back home again, because it's global and local context, how do we ensure the cross-departmental collaboration, which is a word that was used very emphatically by the panel just now, to ensure that the government is also collaborating across the departments in terms of the policy rollout, in terms of the metrics, anything from your perspective in terms of how do we really drive from growing ambition to action to make sure that we move the agenda forward?
Well, I mean, I think it's really, really important question. I think one of the ways is through things like natural capital markets. I think here in the UK we have huge strength in the financial sector. We have huge need in terms of the nature depletion that other people have spoken about, and I think there is, as we heard from Khadija and others, a level of real commitment. But how do we actually bring that to fruition? Well, I think we heard from the previous panel that what the business sector needs in order to invest is they need certainty, they need opportunity, they need stability. And I think it was really positive that we saw the most recent auction on renewables so oversubscribed after the disappointment of the previous one. And I think that the government has shown huge sort of commitment when it's come to renewable energy. I think it will be fair to say, has it shown the same commitment on nature? Not yet. And so it is important that committees like mine and those other powerful voices continue to hold government to account to be as committed on nature as it has been on energy and environment.
Yeah, on that, Toby, let me just say that there seems to be a lot of agreement sort of in the contributions tonight, and we've heard previously from Secretary of State on Environment, Steve Reed, and from Secretary of State for Net Zero, Ed Miliband, about the need for join up and integration, as Akis was saying here, the need to kind of rebuild our natural infrastructure at the same time as building our built infrastructure. But we then had the Prime Minister's comments last Thursday that seemed to kind of posit environment and development as opposites almost, you know, which was quite disappointing from my point of view. Why do you think, where do you think that came from? Because that felt like a real surprise and on that.
I mean, I think sometimes comments can be taken out of context. I've heard Keir Starmer say on many occasions that he sees our environmental imperatives as part of our industrial and economic strategy rather than as contradictory to it. And that's absolutely, the approach that I believe we should take. And I think that, again, it needs to be followed up in action. So, we have, for example, the government's reforms on planning. It's a key part of their economic as well as sort of social policy objectives. We need to make sure they've talked about a new land framework, land use framework, and we need to make sure that those two work hand in hand, because if you have a sound land use framework, that actually helps to support that need for the industrial development. Again, we've heard Angela Rayner, who's in charge of this area, saying that nature and the house building targets can work hand in hand. That's great to hear. We just need to make sure it's really true, and so we'll be looking at the planning policy framework, in great detail.
I think the last
That's
one.
expected in the new year now, isn't it? The planning infrastructure bill will be published in the new year.
Yeah. Well, talking about the new year, and we're also coming to the end of this year. So looking at this audience, what are the 3 action points you would like them to focus on in in 2025?
3 each or collectively? Okay.
So we look at it from different lenses. So call to action, people.
Goodness. I mean, I think collectively, what do we need from addressing you as the business community? I appreciate there's people from all kinds of different environments in the room, but I think, the first thing that we need is ambition to invest. I think the second thing we need is to continue the dialogue with government and keep the pressure on government that their drive for growth and economic investment can't be at the expense of the environment. And I think, basically what the government has said so far is in entirely the right place. Now we've just got to make sure the policy follows that through. And I think, thirdly, in terms of issues like the nature markets, really what we need to see is that where organisations make investments, that the business can show that it too is a reliable partner, and that business that gets involved in new investments delivers in the way that we have seen happily on many occasions, but also unfortunately not in other occasions too.
Great, thank you. Lamé, we should go to questions from the audience. I think.
Yes, it's time. You. Two. Okay. Oh. Was in focus. Okay, one from this end, one from this end.
Yeah, gentleman here at the front.
Bookends.
William Vine. I'm a trustee of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. It's been interesting to hear that a lot of the sort of high-level strategic views are coming from the COPs and talking in longer-term terms of what we're going to do. Looking at it from a slightly different angle, 2030 is 5 years away. The Wildlife Trusts have set a lot of very specific targets of what we're going to do by 2030. Are we going to make it, or are we going to do an absolutely fantastic job by 2040? Is there enough delivery? Are we identifying enough specific things that we're just going to get on and do in the next 5 years so we can look back and say, yeah, we did it?
You mean the government, not the Wildlife Trust? You were talking about, yeah.
It's both,
no,
but I think
I'm talking about everybody here. And
we have as well. But no, let's talk about the government.
Yeah, why not? I was really welcoming the fact you were being put under pressure for a change. Yeah, so do I think we are going to do enough? I think there's potential. I think Keir Starmer committed the UK government to really exacting emissions performance in Baku. It was a commitment that was very widely welcomed. You know, we have to, I think it's worth remembering that in terms of our environmental performance, emissions performance in this country compared to major European nations, before we even start on America, China and others, you know, we are way ahead with the 50% reduction in emissions since 1990 of most of our competitors. But, you know, Keir Starmer committed us to 81%. You know, that is, as we heard previously, going to be more challenging again than what we've already delivered. So I think there are immediate targets there. I think in terms of the Environment Act targets, they were really innovative, but we are not on target to hit them. The government have committed to a rapid review of the Environment Improvement Plan, which is the means of achieving that. And they are committed still to those targets. So it is very important that when that rapid review comes out, which is going to be, I'm told, in sort of February of 2025, that they have taken on board the reports of the Office for Environmental Protection about the steps that are going to be needed in order to ramp up those achievements. So I hope that we absolutely will collectively see real progress by 2030, and we have a government that's committed to that, and we have clear milestones now to achieve that. So, you know, I hope that we will see that sort of those steps coming forward.
And I think he just gave you 3 actions to get started in 2025. So there you go. I think we have one more question from the
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Thanks. So my question is about supply chains, I think. So there's been a lot of work from the government which has looked at sort of the Future Home Standard or biodiversity net gain, all of those sort of downstream impacts. So you build a home and it's built to a net zero or low carbon standard. That's for the whole life of the home. You do biodiversity net gain, and that's for the area that you've built over a long period. The bit upstream, when you're building that home, how do we make sure that we're tackling embodied carbon in materials? How do we make sure we're tackling embodied ecological impacts in materials? And I just wondered if there's any thinking in government around how we make sure that the whole life cycle of development is sustainable.
I mean, it's a really good question. I just wish I had a better answer. I think that it is something that I hope government will look at. I mean, I can't honestly say that I know that it is being looked at, but I do think that the whole question of, as government plan to sort of, if you like, loosen the planning controls, we've heard about that in Parliament today, that there is real, a real sort of ability for whoever it is that is assessing these planning applications to ensure that the new houses that get built are built in an environmentally friendly way. And that partly would deal with energy sources, partly that deals with transport infrastructure, partly that deals with building materials and others. And so I think that it is, if you like, going to be the key proof in the pudding point about the planning reforms that come out, is if you are going to make it easier for developers to build things by loosening those, what are the safeguards you're going to give us all in terms of the environmental performance? So I don't have the as specific an answer as you gave, but I think it will be a crucial thing for us to look at.
I think we might have time for one more, maybe from the back. One more. We've got 2 minutes on the clock. Any takers? Okay.
We've satisfied demand there.
Okay.
There was one in front. He did put his hand up before, so the bonus.
Thank you. Very short question. My name's Tom Butterworth. I'm from Arup. There's a bill going to Parliament on the 24th of January called the Climate and Nature Bill. Will you be supporting it? And if not, why not? And if you are, so, who else are you telling about it?
I'm not certain yet about the content of the bill. I think it's a private member's bill, and you know, I suspect that government will think that the commitments that are in that are too sort of generally based to actually be supportable. But at this stage, I'm not certain about the content of the bill, so I can't give you, I'm afraid, a commitment either way on that. Okay.
On that note, I think we're good to call it to a close, right?
Yeah, we will. We're just trying to pull it together. Please give a huge thanks to Toby Perkins, Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. And also a big thanks to Lamé for co-chairing that session there. And again to the Crown Estate for hosting. So yeah, I'm delighted for us to be drawing this to a close. Hope you found it a really useful discussion tonight, and you will be able to watch it on the Wildlife Trust YouTube channel tomorrow night when it goes out, and you'll look at it and you'll think, God, it looks even better online than it did in real life. You'll think, absolutely amazing. I think just to reflect on a few things, from us as the Wildlife Trusts, we do believe, you know, all this attention around the international frameworks, they're hugely important, but they're only ever as good as how they're delivered back in individual countries. And the UK does need to be taking a leadership position on both the implementation of the climate and the nature conventions. That's what will make a real difference. And we also believe that there is not this trade-off between environment and development. We think it's absolutely essential that, as was said here, you know, we've got these targets to rebuild our natural infrastructure in the next 5 years. We've committed as a country, and it was signed up to under a Conservative government, and it's been very much championed under a Labour government, so there's cross-party support, to get 30% of our land, inland waters and sea in recovery for nature by 2030. We're currently at around 4% in England, so that's a big job to do in the next 5 years. And if we see rebuilding our natural infrastructure as a job that's separate from building our energy infrastructure that we need for the 21st century, and separate again from building houses, we will fail on all of them. I can guarantee that. But if we do them in a joined up, integrated way, we might just have a chance. So thinking about how they're joined up is important. And just also I'd say a word or two about planning, because, you know, planning always gets a bad rap. And yes, there's things around the planning system that perhaps could be changed. When I was trying to install some solar panels on my house about 6 years ago, I had to get planning permission, while at the same time, all you needed was permitted fracking could count as permitted development. So I think there are things that are wrong with planning. Some things should be easier, some things should be a lot harder, I think. But what I do think we need is a better indication of what good should look like. We need a better sort of societal conversation as to what does it look like to build 1.5 million homes in a nature-positive way and in a way that's good for people's health. What does it look like to build the energy infrastructure we need in a way that's nature-positive? And then we need to hopefully have a planning system that stimulates a race to the top amongst developers as to how they can build housing and infrastructure in a nature-positive way. That's what we really want, rather than trying to bolt on conditions later on through the process. That would speed things up and enable innovation, and then hopefully means we keep getting better and better at how we build things in a nature-positive way. And I think there's a quid pro quo. If we are going to speed things up for developers in this country. I think it's only right to expect more from them in building to better quality when it comes to nature in the process. That's what we think at the Wildlife Trust is absolutely essential, and we'll be looking for to be put in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill in one form or another. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you to all the brilliant speakers on the panel. Thank you again to Toby for taking time out to join us. And what is really exciting is there's a wonderful catering infrastructure that's been built while you've been talking as well. So let's go and enjoy that. Thank you very much. Good night.